12 interesting facts about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Find out more about the world's worst nuclear disaster that struck a Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine, which left its effects to this day. On April 26, 1986, the world's worst nuclear disaster struck the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine. Unlike the 2011 Fukushima nuclear crisis in Japan, the Chernobyl reactor explosion was caused by human error rather than a natural disaster. On that spring day more than 30 years ago, routine maintenance was scheduled at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant's fourth reactor, and workers planned to use the downtime to test whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. However, during the test, workers violated safety protocols and the power surged. Although there were attempts to completely shut down the reactor, another power surge caused a chain reaction of explosions inside the plant. Finally, the core of the nuclear plant itself was exposed, spewing a cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere, which spread across northern and western Europe, reaching as far as the eastern United States. Despite the death of 2 people in the explosions, from the hospitalization of workers, firefighters, and the danger of fallout and fire, no one in the surrounding areas was evacuated until about 36 hours after the disaster began. Ultimately, the Soviet Union evacuated 335,000 people. Nearly 30 people initially died as a result of the explosion and more than 100 were injured. The eventual death toll at Chernobyl is the subject of speculation and dispute, with calculations ranging from thousands to hundreds of thousands. Soviet authorities did not immediately admit the explosion damaged the image of reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who had already launched his glasnost policies for greater openness in Soviet society. Even after the last person who was alive on the day of the explosion died, other deaths can be attributed to Chernobyl because of radiation that entered the food chain. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reported that more than 6,000 children and teenagers developed cancer after being exposed to radiation from the incident, although some experts have disputed this claim. Shrouded in secrecy, the incident was a watershed in both the Cold War and nuclear history. Now, more than 30 years later, scientists still estimate that the roughly 30-kilometer-wide exclusion zone will not be habitable for at least 3,000 years due to dangerously high levels of contamination. Containment and monitoring efforts continue and cleanup is expected to last until at least 2065. The disaster was estimated to have caused about $235 billion in damage. We will now look at 12 of the most interesting facts about Chernobyl. 1. 3 men prevented Europe from becoming uninhabitable. 3 men, also known as the Suicide Squad, performed a heroic act that saved Europe from an explosion that could have rendered the continent uninhabitable for thousands of years. There was a risk of a second explosion several days after the first explosion in Reactor 4. These 3 men volunteered to dive into the pool of contaminated water and find the valves to drain the water. It was considered a suicide mission and nearly impossible because they were forced to find the valves in total darkness. But somehow they managed to complete the mission and, even better, they survived too. These 3 heroes are Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov and Boris Baranov. 2 of them are still alive. 2. Chernobyl may have actually been a boon for wildlife. Immediately after the accident, an area of about 4 square kilometers became known as the Red Forest, because many of the trees turned reddish-brown and died after absorbing high levels of radiation. However, this area has paradoxically become a unique sanctuary for biodiversity, declared the Chernobyl Forum in 2005. Due to the exclusion of human activity around the closed factory, the number of some wild animals, including wolves, bears, eagles, bobcats and elk, increased. Even though some species appear to thrive, radiation has been shown to cause significant and potentially deadly abnormalities in others, such as birds with deformed beaks, elevated levels of cataracts, albinism, and lower rates of beneficial bacteria. 3. Plants and animals in Chernobyl mutated. Some may imagine animals with 3 heads or other types of abnormalities due to radiation mutation, but most animals actually look a lot like normal animals even though their DNA has been altered. Genetic mutations increased by 20 times, but there were only a few oddities recorded when it came to physical mutations. For Chernobyl has become a scary tourist attraction. Although the exclusion zone is still uninhabitable, Ukrainian authorities opened the area to tourism in 2011. Since then, guides have regularly welcomed visitors to see the wildlife, as well as to explore the hastily abandoned ghost towns that pepper the landscape. Pripyat, for example, once had a population of more than 45,000, including most of the factory workers and their families. To minimize exposure to radiation, guides carry dosimeters and instruct their clients not to eat or smoke outdoors. 5. There was no containment building. Chernobyl did not have some important safety measures in place. There was no containment building or gas-tight enclosure surrounding the nuclear reactor. The structure is usually dome-shaped and made of steel-reinforced concrete. It is designed to confine fission products that could be released into the atmosphere during an accident. Additionally, the reactor's emergency safety systems were turned off. To perform the maintenance test, workers recklessly disabled the emergency central cooling system and other important safety equipment. A chain of operational errors followed, resulting in the accumulation of steam that caused the reactor to overheat. 6. Most of the damage ended just a few weeks after the explosion. The greatest radiation damage after the explosion happened in the first few weeks. Just 15 minutes after the Chernobyl explosion, radioactivity fell to a quarter of its initial value. After a day, it dropped to a 15th, and after 3 months, it dropped to less than 1%. The factory only closed years later. When the Unit 4 reactor exploded, the other 3 reactors at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant were also shut down, but they were all restarted within a year and a half or so, despite international condemnation. Thousands of plant operators continued working, only to see a fire in the turbine hall lead to the closure of Unit 2 in 1991. 7. The Soviet Union tried to cover up the disaster. Immediately after the Chernobyl reactor meltdown, Soviet authorities largely kept their own citizens in the dark and did not attempt to warn neighboring countries. On April 28, 1986, the cover-up began to fall apart when Swedish aerial monitors detected large amounts of radiation in the atmosphere that appeared to have originated in the USSR. When pressed for a response to radiation, the Soviets admitted that an accident had killed 2 people at Chernobyl. However, they also lied that the situation was now under control. It took until May 6 for authorities to close schools in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, and warn residents to stay indoors. 8. The cleanup after the fallout was much deadlier than the initial explosions. Although reports vary, at least 600,000 people were sent to fight the fire and clean up the worst of the nuclear plant's contamination. These people, who became known as liquidators, were given a special status that meant they would receive benefits such as extra medical care and payments. All were exposed to high levels of radiation. A controversial report published by members of the Russian Academy of Sciences estimated that between 112,000 and 125,000 of these liquidators, about 15%, died in 2005. Many of the report's figures were later challenged by Western scientists, who questioned their scientific validity. 9. The death toll is unknown. Chernobyl's eventual death toll is subject to speculation and dispute. Even after the last person who was alive on the day of the explosion died, other deaths can be attributed to Chernobyl because of radiation that entered the food chain. The cancer research arm of the World Health Organization, WHO, suggests that 9,000 people will die from Chernobyl-related cancer and leukemia if deaths follow a pattern similar to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Environmental group Greenpeace says the death toll from Chernobyl could reach 90,000. Others estimate an even higher number. 10. The radiation level was similar to that of Hiroshima. It is believed that those exposed to radiation when the Chernobyl reactor exploded received about 45 rem dosage of radiation on average. 45 is similar to the average dose received by survivors after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Although 45 rem is not enough to cause radiation sickness, which usually occurs at about 200 rem, it still increases the risk of cancer by almost 2%. 11. People still live there illegally. Although the vast majority of the exclusion zone remains devoid of humans, a few hundred residents have returned illegally. Even after thousands were evacuated, some people never left. Despite its illegality, around 130 to 150 people still reside in the area. Many of these residents are women still farming their ancestral lands in their 70s and 80s. And, outside the exclusion zone, there are a number of newcomers. 12. Abortions were performed on women after the incident. An estimated 100,000 to 200,000 abortions were performed on women after the incident because doctors said their babies were exposed to radiation and could be born with birth defects. There was radiophobia, but the WHO says there is no evidence that birth defects were more common in babies born to women who were near Chernobyl. So, what did you think of today's video? Did you already know any of these facts about the Chernobyl disaster? What surprised you most? Let us know your thoughts on this topic, as we would love to respond to your comments below. And if you liked this video and don't want to miss any of the other intriguing videos we post every week, just subscribe to our channel and click the bell to receive all notifications. And if you want to enjoy it and learn a little more, be sure to click on one of these videos that we are suggesting for you. Until the next video.